Welcome to In the Spotlight, where we get the chance to take a breath from the frenzied daily news cycle and delve into an issue or conversation that deserves a deeper dive and can challenge or inspire us. I'm Abigail Pogrobin, and I am delighted to be joined today by Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer, president of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. Yehuda has an unquestionably impressive following, thanks to his lectures and essays about the meaning of Israel to American Jews, Jewish history, and Jewish memory. He was at the helm of creating the Hartman Institute in 2010, which is a pioneering research and educational center for the leadership of the North American Jewish community. And he's also the host of one of my favorite podcasts, Identity Crisis. He's also a regular guest on JBS. I'm sure those of you who are fans of JBS have seen him before. Welcome, Yehuda. It's nice to be with you.
Thanks for having me, Abby.
So I want to start with Jewish conversation because we seem to be having not necessarily less of it, but we're having trouble talking to each other these days. And I'd love you to kind of diagnose, why do you think that's happening, and why does it seem to be especially difficult right now?
Yeah, so I'm glad you said we're not having any less Jewish conversation. I think there's actually an unbelievable amount of noise in the Jewish public square. There is more Jewish blog posting and social media, video, audio production, certainly than we've ever had as a people. And there's actually a tremendous amount of production of Jewish scholarship and content and ideas. But the media is changing faster than we like our brains have caught up with of how we actually conduct these conversations. And we don't have rules yet. So what feels difficult about contemporary Jewish conversation is that it's disordered. Right? The minute you've caught up on the last thing that you're supposed to have read, the next thing is out. We don't really know how to conduct a serious Jewish conversation on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or all of these methods and methodologies. And partly the power game has changed. Right? So anybody is speaking out publicly on important Jewish issues, and that's good. That's democratic. It's great to have more people involved in these conversations.
But there's no filter.
There's no filter. And it's no surprise as a result that many more like politically polarized positions emerge in the Jewish public square, because it doesn't matter whether you lead an organization or have a big budget. If you have something to say, you can say it, and you can find a way to amplify your voice in the public square. People will hear it regardless of whether it's actually a morally good or important message. So I think many of us who are accustomed to a certain type of order in Jewish communal life are the ones who are most disordered by the way that Jewish conversation takes place.
And I want to just make sure when you use those words, order, disorder, it's part of it is the din, part of it is again the lack of kind of editing that's going on. I also think about the research that's shown, particularly I think since 2016, that the angrier your message, the more it gets amplified. Is that something that you think is reflected also in the Jewish community?
For sure. Whenever there's a terrorist attack in Israel, whenever there is an outbreak of hostilities between Israel and the Palestinians, whenever there's a major issue in domestic policy, so many of us who are kind of trained in a different era will pause and think, what does this mean? What are the news sources I should be listening to? Who do I speak to make sure I get it right? We craft our messages. If you work in a big organization, it's got to run through like 6 different steps before a message gets approved. If you're not connected to any of those instruments, and you don't really care about whether you get it right, but you need to be out first, you're going to say it quickly, you're going to say it loudly, and you're going to get amplified as a result. And so all of these pieces are connected. Our ability to kind of get things right has nothing to do with the methodologies that we use to push our ideas into the public square.
So I want to talk about the Hartman Institute as a kind of response to this disorder. For those who really don't understand what the Institute does, I know I've asked you before to define it on one foot, but how do you explain it? And
Sure.
Then kind of where do you think the role what is the role right now of Hartman, and particularly in North America? Because I know there's the Israel partner to this, but because I'm in North America, so I'm sort of focused. I'm focused on through the New York lens, of the American lens.
Right. So if you answer the question as a what, we are a think tank and an educational center for the leadership of the American Jewish community. That's what we are. I'm more interested in answering it from the perspective of why, which is, the Jewish people have been carried throughout our history by the power of 2 commodities, the power of our ideas and the quality of our leaders. Those are, you can study this. We have traveled through enormous turbulence, different places that we've lived. We have transformed the meaning of what it means to be Jewish, and that's because our people has tremendous intellectual and ideological creativity. That's what ideas are. And we are always dependent on innovative and creative leaders who can take those ideas and chart a future for the Jewish people through its turbulence. So if those are your two commodities, that's what the Hartman Institute's interested in. If anything, a moment like this, with the kind of instability that we face, major questions for American Jews about what it means to be American right now, huge questions that we haven't answered about since the Enlightenment, about the meaning of faith and ethics and practice for Jews in the modern world, and the whole question of our relationship to Israel, these are all being contested right now. And we, as an institution, want to be a leader on the side of ideas. What do all these things mean to the Jewish people? What should they mean? And we want to turn that into educational programs because, as you know, as I know, we have good leaders in the Jewish community. We have good rabbis, Hillel directors, JCC directors, etc. But they are starved for content. And the Jewish community will follow quality leaders if they know what they're talking about.
So anytime I've gone to a Hartman event or seminar, there's always text. There's always Torah. There's always Talmud. And I find it thrilling, challenging. I often leave with my head spinning. And I think to myself, not again to pat myself on the back, but this took time. And a lot of people don't give that kind of time or have that kind of time or orient themselves if they're not sort of learners as a practice. You know, it's kind of like, let me get into the issues.
Yeah.
Why are we looking at Genesis right now, or tractate, whatever.
Yeah.
Shabbat. So tell me about the tech, about why is Hartman so, I think, religious about always bringing text in as a foundation or even kind of as an orientation?
Right. So again, I think part of the reason we do our work is because we're trying to strengthen the capacity of our leaders and a Jewish community that should be driven by powerful ideas. The way we do that as Jews is through reading and through studying and through discussing and debate. Now, a Hartman class is not interested in studying text because it's an artifact of the past. In fact, what you notice in the class may be the text, but what's going to make a really powerful class is the teacher and the fellow students in the room who are bringing their fullest personal selves and their deepest thinking, their strongest moral fiber to ask whether that text has something to say to the present. So both of those things are in dialogue with each other. But the reason why this matters, and I tell this to our students all the time in our classes, is that in organizational life and in Jewish life, we're always focused on, oh my God, what am I supposed to do? Now that's an important question for any leader to ask. What do I do when I'm faced with a problem? But the best answers to what should I do are rooted in what is my best understanding of the problem that I'm facing? And who am I? And who are we? If I don't have a clear sense of that, my answers are always going to be political, they're always going to be trivial, and they're always going to be reactive. And I tell our students all the time, when you come into our classroom, the activity is the outcome. This type of study, that's a powerful outcome for Jewish life. We become a group of communal leaders who have the humility to know what we don't know, who have the discipline to do the real work of thinking about what the major questions are, and we emerge differently with a level of competence about the issues and confidence about our ability to address them as a result of those type of study experiences. And that's what we're always going to measure.
And so what is the hurdle for you in terms of, you've seen it works. It is working. I mean, I think Hartman is growing and the demand for your programs and your education are growing, but what's in the way, would you say?
Well, there's always a bias that, especially for adults, we have this myth in the Jewish community that education's for children. And that's one of the biggest mistakes that exists across the Jewish communal ecosystem. So there's a little bit of a bias that anything that comes across as adult education that's like the first budget item to go for a synagogue that's in a budget crisis. Oh, adult ed, we can cut that.
Or it could be a yawn for people.
Yeah, it's an extracurricular activity. Yeah. It's not an essential discipline. And so we class what we do, this is just marketing language, but if you refer to what you do as thought leadership as opposed to adult education, actually we need that. We do need thought leadership. So that's a big obstacle of the bias of what is this and is this really valuable? And the other big obstacle is a perception at times that it's a replacement for the real work of leadership. And so part of the reason why we don't want to talk about ourselves exclusively as a think tank, because we're not interested in kind of pumping ideas into the ether. They're just supposed to like think of something and then suddenly it's an idea in the world. There's no version of Jewish ideas that don't meaningfully have to travel through the leaders, the individuals who carry our communities. And so by living at that bridge, we're trying to signal to people this is really important work, but it doesn't mean that there aren't kind of social obstacles around why people think that's important.
But people want metrics. They want concrete, like proof, results, benchmarks of success. Can you give an example of where you've seen sort of the Hartman way, not necessarily like here's the deliverable, but here's how it changed a conversation, or here's how it changed an institution, or at a decision at a moment for an institution or for a leader? Is there something you can?
I mean, it's a little easier for me to do it retrospectively for our learners than it is for like, oh, in this moment, this institution did exactly this thing. We've been doing programs for rabbis for close to 40 years. In fact, the first programs that David Hartman created at the Shalom Hartman Institute were for rabbis. Our institution loves rabbis. The Jewish community loves to hate rabbis. We love rabbis. We take care of them.
I love rabbis.
I do too. I think they have been the most indispensable gatekeepers of Jewish identity and meaning for 2,000 years, and I think they will continue to be. And the more we invest in rabbis, the better rabbis we get. We look at 40 years of rabbinic education, and we can point to the rabbis who came through our doors at critical inflection points in their careers, and it altered the trajectory of their careers. It changed their interest in thinking in much larger terms about their responsibilities to the Jewish people. Now, you can be a great rabbi who spends your whole life in a congregation, or you can be a great rabbi who decides to go beyond the congregation to serve the Jewish people. And in both cases, we've watched this happen. There was a moment a few years ago when we noticed that the professional and lay leadership of all the major liberal denominations in North America were our alumni. Now, did we make them great? No, they were probably great before they came in. Did we perhaps open their horizons a bit? Yeah, I think we did. And some of them I can name because they'll name themselves. When there was a moment when Rick Jacobs, running the Union for Reform Judaism, who proudly describes the Hartman Institute as his Beit Midrash, and Rabbi Asher Lopatin, who was the president of Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, the Open Orthodox Seminary, they were both alumni. I think they may have been in the same class. And we were watching this happen, and they both would credit the Institute as being critical as an inflection point. So we do see that. We see it in the Hillel world for sure. And we see it among many lay leaders who, by sitting around in Hartman classrooms, changed how they saw their responsibility in Jewish history. So now, that's not always an easy sell to people. You know, we measure our outcomes in 30 to 40 year trajectories rather than 1 to 2 years. But in the span of Jewish history, 30 to 40 years is a pretty short period of time, and we have a long story as the Jewish people of how our methodologies have told the story of the Jewish people.
I know it's a big question, but I want to talk about Jewish identity because right now it feels kind of buffeted, I would say. And particularly as I'm a parent of someone who's 22 and 24, there's a lot of anxiety about our kids, right? Quote unquote, our kids, and what is sort of the substance of their Jewish identity and how are they kind of getting hit from all sides? Is there a way for you to just kind of encapsulate what you think the emergency is, if there is one, and whether it's with your Hartman hat or your own personal hat, do you think the Jewish community's response is correct, effective, answering the problem?
I want to push back on the question because I think the emergency is not with our kids. I think the emergency is with us. If you took away the Jewish question about your kids and I asked you, talk about what's exciting about for your kids for the next 20 to 30 years of your life, you could probably go on for a long time. You're proud of them. They're getting great educations.
I'm a Jewish mother.
Yeah, they're probably going to do great things. They're going to find great partners. Right. They're going to build incredible lives. But something weird happens in the Jewish community around our children, where there's almost, especially in liberal Jewish circles, there's almost a fear of their future when it comes Jewishly, when it comes to their Jewish identities. It's totally bizarre. It's not how we think about like the enthusiasm of helping, it's like this, the phrase now is, I'm helping my kids launch. It's a beautiful phrase. I'm pushing them out to the world. But why are we scared? Why are we scared of what they're going to do Jewishly? In other words, it's not about them. It's about are we the people who gave them the tools to be able to not only withstand the challenges, but to articulate a version of Judaism that we're not prepared for? And you can solve that in two ways. One is we need to fortify the generation of parents. What is it that we're not giving to our children? Is it because we don't have the answers to those questions, so we haven't been prepared to talk to them about being Jewish adults? Maybe that's a little bit of it. That's why it doesn't bother me so much that Hartman specializes more in older Jews than younger Jews, because if you actually want to shape the future, it's not just speaking to the next generation, it's speaking to the generations who are speaking to the next generation. So part of it is on us to strengthen those tools of education, and part of it on us is to develop the fortitude to be prepared for a generation of Jews who's going to do Jewishly very differently than us. That has always happened. Our people would not have made it through Jewish history if there was radical continuity from one generation to the next.
And when you say do Jewishly, you mean in terms of worship or not, in terms of Israel engagement, in terms of
correct. They're going to they'll design
tikkun olam, whatever their iteration of their Jewishness.
They're going to design the institutions that they need for their Jewish lives. If they have strong commitments, if they care about things, I tend to believe that we anthropologically haven't changed that much, that human beings still want community and purpose and meaning, and that heritage is going to still matter. So a lot of what is going to be designed institutionally is going to happen from our children and grandchildren, and it will require some loss by those of us who felt like this is the right model for how to do it. The next best great book of Jewish theology has by definition not been written yet. So like all of those pieces, we're going to rely on them. And I think I think we have to get away a little bit from the hubris of we have to make sure that they are going to sustain Jewishly the world that we've given to them, and get more into the enthusiasm of we have to be prepared for them to lead us Jewishly to places we've never been.
And it's interesting, as you say, they're going to, obviously, God willing, outlive us. Continuity isn't really what I'm hearing as a watchword anymore in terms of the Jewish anxiety or communal organizations talking a lot about continuity. There is more conversation about a kind of a crisis of Jewish pride, or being able to be publicly proud of your Jewishness, Judaism. How would you say, as a father yourself,
yeah,
maybe it's too pediatric and rudimentary a question, but many will ask it. How do you instill Jewish pride in the next generation?
Look, the last Pew study, one of the good numbers in the Pew study that studied American Jews was that I think 95% of Jews say that they're proud to be Jewish. So as a self-reporting line, Jews are proud to be Jewish. I don't think we have a pride problem. I'm not sure we have a continuity problem. I think we definitely have a thickness problem.
And by that you mean?
Meaning saying that I'm proud to be Jewish, but not knowing much about my Jewishness, not demonstrating Jewish behaviors, not being able to be a real sophisticated thinker about Jewishness, that's pronounced. And I think over time, I will stop being proud of something if I don't have a lot to say about it. Like if it doesn't constitute like a really meaningful part of my life. But if that's the challenge, see, when we frame the problem as continuity, we're always on the defensive. We feel something is slipping away from us. If you're in the thickness business, okay, well, what's our job as Jewish educators to throw in? Like, how do we pack more in? With my kids, listen, I get thrilled when my kids ask me Jewish questions that I haven't thought of. Just last night, this has never happened, so it's just a coincidence happened last night. One of my kids came home and said, hey, can we go over my Talmud homework? I'm like, oh yes, what an onerous chore that I'll do that with you. And then when my other kids, unbeknownst, came down an hour later and was like, can we go over, I'm preparing for this quiz in school, a Bible quiz, can we go over the material? I'm like, yes, sure. Now, my kids go to day school. They're unusual. They're outliers relative to American Jews. But they got excited about this. And they wanted to do it together, and they wanted to do it with me. And I think that regardless of the schooling choices you make for your kids, your excitement about certain things, Jewishly, will radiate for your kids more than, here, my job as a parent is to make you excited about something that I'm not excited about. Never gonna play. That's that whole adult versus pediatric. We think like we have to give Jewishness to our children, as opposed to we have to live rich and thick Jewish lives, and our children will see it. Maybe they'll want to be a part of it, but at least they'll know what it is they're rejecting if they don't want to.
You, I know at Hartman, are beginning to also look at that age group in terms of your programming.
Yeah.
What are your, why? Why have you decided that this is something that matters for the Institute to address?
Yeah, so part of it is I think we, especially around Israel, we as a Jewish community made a little bit of a category error of thinking that where there are complicated political challenges for Jews, especially around Israel, well, that sets in at the college campus level. And the truth is that's not really true. It sets in much younger. Children have access to much more information than before. And as opposed to entering into the college campus space to try to do something sophisticated with young Jews, we should actually be starting with a sophisticated Judaism at any level that a person wants to have. The real reason, though, we went there is we were effectively asked. During the pandemic, we started doing a lot more programming across the kind of age spectrum online. We were, removed all the barriers of travel, et cetera, and we were overwhelmed by interest from teens. And I think part of the reason we were overwhelmed with interest from teens didn't matter whether they went to day schools or went to public schools or, other private schools. There's very little that's available for teens that speaks to them like adults. It's not customizing Judaism for the teen audience. It actually says you can have an adult conversation about this. At age 15, 16, you're already thinking in those terms. And if you don't have an adult conversation, then you're basically saying, well, at a certain point you age out of what Judaism has to offer. Or maybe you'll re-enter when you have kids that need to have a bar mitzvah in the synagogue. So when we saw that, we said, okay, well, this is now our responsibility. They are looking for this. They're desperate for it. And whether it's on Israel or whether it's on complicated political questions, gender, race, class in America, whether it's on classic questions, faith, ethics, practice, Jewish law, there's a real hunger by younger Jews for this. And I think that's one of the things that makes me optimistic. If this is what people want, great, we got to get to work. And we have to deliver what it is that they need and they want.
Well, I see a lot of kind of teen programming very oriented towards kind of talking points, especially when it comes to Israel. If we just make sure they know these 5 things, then they'll be ready to kind of do battle or be litigators kind of on Israel's behalf. And I see that failing in a certain way because either a student feels ill-equipped, I don't know enough, I'm not expert enough, I don't have enough facts, or they're just the pressures from whether it's social media or their peers, they opt out because they're not going to be in a fight that they can't win. What's your response to those kind of waves, that the trend of the pressure that's on them, and also this sense that I think the answer for many Jewish organizations is if they just know these things, they'll be able to be soldiers for Zionism?
Listen, I'll be the first to tell you, I don't think fact sheets work. I don't think traditional advocacy works except for those who are already committed to its values. So a fact sheet will reinforce the commitments that somebody already holds. And I think we are learning this in America today, especially over the last number of years since the 2016 election. I'll even go further than this. It's not just advocacy doesn't work, it's that human beings do not really form our political views on the basis of facts. We don't actually form most of our views on the basis of facts. We form our views on the basis of deep values that we hold and big stories that we tell, what we sometimes call memory. That can be formed based on how you grow up, what stories are told to you. It could be a collective memory or personal memory, but it's not about facts. And what happens is once we have deep belief systems about the world, we go in search of fact patterns that reinforce those belief systems. And in fact, it's so rare that a human being will encounter a fact pattern which totally ruptures what they believe to be true, that they will overturn their identity. It's so rare that we have a term from phenomenology of religious literature called converts, which until the relatively recent was an unusual thing, that a person would say, I'm going to reject my whole background and choose a different story for the world. When we recognize that people are about values and narratives and stories and they search for facts, it has to change how we think as educators. Our work should be in values. When you want to talk to young Jews about Israel, you have to talk to them about what is difficult from their values narrative about the state of Israel and what aligns. You have to get them into a conversation about what do What did they grow up with? What did their parents grow up with? What did their grandparents grow up with? What does this story mean in Jewish history? And I don't mean to say that it's irrelevant to know something basic about this story, about this reality. I just don't think that there's a viable educational strategy that's going to run through assuming if I just get you the right pieces of information, it's necessarily going to transform your identity.
But you're speaking in a way that I completely, aspire to and feel like it's a path forward. But it's not the reality I'm watching, which is much more polarization. So you're a family that's here, or you're a family that's there. You either have no misgivings, or you have some misgivings, and then you're kind of writing yourself out, particularly of the Zionist conversation. So can you just address whether we're talking about raising kids or even just in our own Jewish circles, how we're kind of, I guess in some ways, siloing ourselves so that we're deciding whether someone is with us or against us?
Well, we are doing that. And it's not just the Jewish community, which, by the way, should make us feel a little bit better about ourselves. It's not Jews uniquely behaving a certain way. We are just exhibiting the same larger trends that Americans are doing.
Canceling each other.
Canceling each other. Do you know that people are moving geographically to relocate next to people who vote the same way they do?
Yeah.
So it's not just in the.
I know people who have.
Right. It's extraordinary, right? It's
yes.
extraordinary. So there's a larger trend of global polarization. It's no surprise that Jews are doing it. So one thing that it's important for us to think about is when Jews imitate a larger trend, what story is it telling us about as Jews? And in this case, I think the most powerful story is that Jews are at home enough in America that we can act this way like Americans. That's interesting news, right? We can unpack that. The other thing for us to consider is whether Jewish communal organizations can construct something alternative and can act counterculturally. There are such spaces like that.
Say that again.
Can Jewish spaces be countercultural to what's going on in America?
So even though we're mirroring it, can we, in
and I think
resist?
The only way that's going to happen is that if we resist in our institutions collapsing what we talk about as moral issues and values issues with partisan agendas. That's the main project of our time on this. The minute that if I care about human rights, that means that this particular policy prescription is good and that particular policy prescription is evil, we're dead. Because then I've constructed my moral universe only with people who subscribe to the same policy position. But what if we found a way to talk to other Jews about shared commitments? We both care about justice. We both, for instance, care on right and left. People will tell you that, of course, they care about welcoming the stranger, being kind to the stranger, for you were a stranger in the land of Egypt. That's carried with us for a long time. Does that mean this exact policy on immigration? We probably have different opinions on that policy. But could we find a way to construct a Beit Midrash, a study house together, where we're excavating what are actual ideas that we are passionate about, our values, our stories? Number one, I think we might be able to persuade each other a little bit politically. David Hartman used to say, it's not that I believe in pluralism because everybody's right. It's just how can I convince you you're wrong if I don't talk to you? So I have to be able to do some of that. But the more transcendent idea is that Judaism is a discourse that is bigger than simply partisan political expression.
But you're not advocating that we all come to the same place. I mean, I've heard you many times in the past. It's not about consensus necessarily.
No, it's not about. It's certainly not reaching the same political outcome. Listen, I'm a voter. People can guess what I vote for, but I go to the ballot box and I vote in the privacy of a ballot box about what I think are the right policy prescriptions. And in the ballot box, you're given a choice between A and B. As moral people, we are more than A and B. Oftentimes, have you ever had the experience where you vote and you're holding your nose in either direction?
Yeah.
Right? So what does that tell you? Does that mean that my moral universe is defined by option A or option B? No, my moral universe is much bigger than that. And these are the inferior options that I'm presented.
But we're not living in a time where complexity is affirmed. Like I'm thinking about you and how many times people kind of try to assume where you land politically. And sometimes they can kind of sniff out certain things, but then they're going to get confused. And I also, in however 20 years of knowing you, have never heard you shout. You're not a shouter.
I'm not a shouter.
But there's a lot of shouting right now, and it's kind of working in certain spaces. So I guess I'm asking for those who are trying to pin you down, even you, politically, and they're trying, and they're also, you clearly have passion, but you're not expressing it in the way that is kind of the vernacular of the moment. Is there sort of the Yehuda Kurtzer way of a little more calm and a little more kind of uncertainty about where we each, when you test those values, where we each land? Like, is that a realistic goal even?
Look, you said at the beginning, our organization's growing. So that's data, right? It means that actually more people do want slower, more deliberative, more serious. They want something else, right? It also might be that we lose a little bit. It also might be that in the context of shouting, those who refuse to play by that game are going to lose a little bit.
Yep.
And I think we have to be prepared for that loss. I don't think the whole problem with populism is that it has in its mind that just because people like it and are engaging with it, they then think it's a moral position. The anti-populist position knows it's not popular. But it has to work differently. It has to play a long game. We have to build communities of learners who are more resilient. I mean, that's the work. And the fact that I don't want to play by the rules of shouting and screaming. And Abby, I've had the experience at times where I've gotten myself, for instance, down a rabbit hole on Twitter. I responded to somebody, I got yelled at, I started pushing back.
I watched it happen.
It happened last summer, I think. And I felt sick about it for days.
Yeah.
I deleted all my tweets. I felt sick about it. I was like, did I persuade anybody? Probably not. Did I inflame people? Definitely. Did I get really, really aggravated? So if you're in the educational work and if you're in the long-term game, you have to resist the short-term stuff because it'll kill you.
So let's go to an easy question, which is your own faith.
Yeah.
I know that you're obviously observant, your family, but I had the privilege of interviewing you for a series I did for The Forward on talking about God, faith, belief, with leaders, clergy, and scholars.
Yeah.
And you. I guess what I would love is to just go back to one of the things that you highlighted, which was a challenge to me and has stayed with me, that a Jewish person is an ambivalent person. And that actually uncertainty is, in a way, a reification of what it means to be a Jew. Can you give me a little bit more on that for this audience and why that for you is kind of where you locate your belief?
So I'll give you a text that's a kind of classic in a Hartman Beit Midrash, one that we've been studying for a long time. For 3 years, there was a dispute between the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai. In fact, we don't even get, when the Talmud talks about this, they don't give us the details of what they were arguing about, but they had a legal dispute. And then a voice comes out from heaven and says, both positions, these and these, are the words of the living God, but the law comports to the house of Hillel. So what's going on theologically if both of these positions can be right? So human beings are going to have to choose between option A and option B, but God's world of truth is totally different than ours. In fact, any truth claim that we make about the world has to be hedged by a deep amount of humility that it can never have certainty. Rabbi Yitz Greenberg has written about this too, that's the big post-Holocaust lesson, is that the people who were most certain about what they believed brought about a totalitarian regime that murdered millions of people. So what we have to become is people who hedge our truth claims. That's what we have to be. And so much about rabbinic Judaism, rabbinic culture, the vibrancy of discussion and debate, it's not just about being ambivalent about our own truth claims, it's also the activity of validating the fundamental legitimacy of the person you're talking to. Something about what you're saying, I don't know if it's right, but it has to have the possibility of being right. And I just think that's the story we Jews have been telling ourselves in the rabbinic tradition for a couple thousand years. So I'm really skeptical. Look, in general, I'm skeptical when people talk affirmatively about God. I'm really skeptical about it. What do you know? Like, what do you really know? You can have, this is what I think, this might be possible. That's what I mean by ambivalence, the willingness to say, I hold on to something that I think is right, but I also hold out to the possibility of it being slightly wrong. And I think that's also, a world-changing idea.
And where does spirituality fit in for you? A feeling of being connected to the divine. Is that something that
My
can
most
share?
powerful spiritual experiences are about community. They always have been. I find I love the high holidays because I love being with all these people who are seeking something and who are seeking something collectively. I think to me that's magical. I'm not at a point right now in my life where my own spirituality is located as much in individual prayer. I never have been a person who actually uses prayer to ask for things. That feels unseemly. Nothing I'm asking for can actually rise to the level. But I do find powerful spiritual experiences in groups, and that can be sometimes in the context of prayer. It can be in, hopefully one day when we're back in a full Beit Midrash in Jerusalem, when I have 200 rabbis sitting in anticipation for real Torah to learn together. Those are really powerful spiritual experiences.
So I assume then the pandemic, which separated us, was a hard sort of spiritual stretch.
It was hard. There was one pretty significant upside, which was I didn't travel, which I do for work, and so I had the intimacy of our 5-person immediate family. And I will say having dinner together every night was a spiritual experience. It was grounding, it was rooted. We saw each other differently. We grew closer together as a family. And I think that tracks as having a kind of communal sensibility to it.
I want to talk about your book, The New Jewish Canon, which you co-edited with Dr. Claire Sufrin, who's also a friend. It came out in 2020, and I guess I want to start with why you chose to put it together and why now.
So the book actually came out of teaching. In the context of my teaching, when I started doing this work, I was teaching much more rabbinic texts to the present moment. And I found myself gravitating towards contemporary texts to help tell the story of all of the turbulence that we're experiencing as Jews around identity, around ideology, and around our institutions. And I wound up using a whole bunch of contemporary texts between 1980 and 2015, which is the time frame of the book, that felt to me not like secondary sources anymore. It's not like the old texts are the primary sources and these are secondary, but these felt like primary sources, whether it was extraordinary rulings from the Israeli Supreme Court, which give you a deep window into Israel's tensions around Jewish and democratic, whether it's new works of Jewish theology around feminism or sexuality. We're living in a period of incredible foment and transformation, and I didn't have a textbook. And Claire is the same way. She's a professor of modern Jewish thought. We didn't have a textbook. Claire and I met in the context of a mini conference that we organized at Hartman around post-Holocaust theology. And it originated from our both noticing that when people talk about post-Holocaust theology, they usually stop the clock in the 70s, as though we haven't had 40 years of post-Holocaust theology since. So we needed a textbook to capture the moment that we're in, and in fact for our own teaching. And that's what prompted the book, which is a collection of primary sources and essays by scholars unpacking why these texts are significant and should be seen as significant.
And the essays respond to those texts.
The essays are idiosyncratic. I mean, there's some that are more academic than others, but the main prompt we asked of all the people who were writing essays about these pieces is, why does this matter? And we got vastly different opinions and answers about the various contributions.
It's fascinating. I want to just go to a little bit of the controversy, because I know you can handle it. First, the title, the fact that it was the New Jewish Canon. So what's your response to the possible arrogance of the title?
Yeah, I get it. I think we were being cheeky. You don't really know what a canon is going to be until long after the fact. But I also think those who would get away from the term canon at all are missing the fact that canons are being produced all the time. They happen implicitly, so you want to actively be involved in the construction of that. So I get some of the critique, but I felt a little bit of the pushback around that was just, sometimes scholars can be a little catty. Yeah. Of like,
a little mean.
A little mean.
And then there were those who weren't included.
And, I could show you the letters.
Jews Left Out, that's its own book.
Correct. The New Jewish Canon, The Cutting Room Floor, the sequel. Right.
But on a more serious note, those who have been, I would say, besmirched by some of the Me Too, either accusations documented or not, and the fact that I think 3 are included who have had their own controversies, I think very different levels of controversy, I would say. But you chose to keep them in the book, and I just want to quote, you say, our goal in this book is to capture the dominant ideas and debates of the period 1980 to 2015. At times this has meant including the work of individuals who are known to have committed bad acts in their personal and or professional lives, or whose ideas we personally find offensive or even dangerous. But what they wrote at the time was either seminal or certainly was a marker in how people responded Jewishly to the moment, either sociologically or religiously.
Yeah.
So how would you go beyond that defense, or where does it sit with you now that you're a year out?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think the process would have looked quite different had we started this book post Me Too, had we started this book following the murder of George Floyd, when the mindset of the communities that we're in were different, and therefore it would have changed. I don't think that most of what we included would have been excluded, but it's a signal to the proof of the concept of the book, which is that historical periods that we're in influence the world of ideas that are dominant. That said, so we started the book back in 2015 before some of these allegations and accusations. I'm still going to go to the bat for the idea that if what you're trying to do is understand the world that you're in, you have to be willing to accept as part of the primary documents of that period things that are written by people you don't like, and things that are written and contributed by people who did terrible things. I don't think that in and of itself, as we were accused by one person, is an act of violence towards their victims. I think in some ways, paradoxically, it affirms their danger. And what was surprising to us about this was there were a whole bunch of individuals who were in the book who never got mentioned as being like, how could you dare publish them? Meir Kahane. We have primary texts of Meir Kahane. We have primary texts by the religious figures who wrote the literature that inspired Yigal Amir to assassinate Yitzhak Rabin. Never mentioned by the critics. But it was the Me Too allegations that prompted this controversy. And it's pretty clear that part of that is because some of those issues are not resolved. It's not like everybody acknowledged their wrongdoing. You're talking about living and breathing victims. You're talking about a very short time period between those accusations and when this table of contents appears. And this may seem minor, the controversy emerged when the table of contents of the book was published and before the book was published. And so even the presentation, how do you curate this, was totally out of the picture. All it looked like was, and it goes back to the title, Yehuda Kurtzer and Claire Sufrin are canonizing these individuals. We are declaring them saintly. And that was never our intention. Our intention was to use this as an educational tool to understand contemporary Jewry.
And I know that the book is being used as an educational tool, and it goes back to where we started this conversation, where it is highlighting debate. It is highlighting the conversations that have shaped us. Is that your hope for this book?
That's the dream. When I've heard of a lot of rabbis who are using this as an educational tool, and what I want them to do is two things. One is, let's understand the last 40 years, because as we started at the beginning, it feels like you're living in a period of whiplash. Things are moving so quickly. This book should help you understand the intellectual trends that got us to this moment. And then what I really want as an educational tool is for rabbis to ask, what's the next 30 years going to look like? And, by the way, what did we miss? Those are powerful educational questions to ask. Are there trends that we didn't fully anticipate and fully capture? And there are a whole bunch. The minute, you know this, Abby, but the minute you send something to the publisher, you want to
take it back?
Oh, wait, could we do this? We even tried. We tried to submit something a month before it came out, and they were like, you're done. The book's over. So I think that's part of how you turn something like this from being a book that sits in a shelf into a dynamic educational tool.
So I want to end, and I don't think it's a non sequitur, because so much of the book is about the post-Holocaust thinking and kind of impression that it's made on all of us and generations to come. We are in a time of a spike of anti-Semitism that is kind of unequivocal. However you want to slice the data, we're all seeing it, feeling it. And I feel like your response is different than, again, many Jewish organizations where it's just alarm and kind of like batten down the hatches. And I don't blame them, because I'm feeling shaken in a way I haven't in my lifetime. But what is your response? First of all, it goes back to the Seder, in every generation our enemy rises to destroy us. It feels like it confirms something that we hoped would not have to be.
Yeah.
So I'd love you to respond to that. And then just how should it sit with us? Should we not be as disquieted as we are?
I don't want to be misunderstood on this. There are two really different agendas in Jewish life that pertain to anti-Semitism. One agenda is protect and defend, and the other agenda is not losing our agency as Jews to decide who we are in the world. One of the huge risks that's in front of us right now is that the two are getting collapsed. And whenever I have the impulse of protecting and defending, anything else sounds like it's a waste of time. It sounds like a luxury item. It sounds irrelevant because, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, protecting myself comes first and everything else comes second. And I just don't think that was ever really true. I think in the Seder, we say, yes, in every generation they rise up to destroy us, and God saves us. Not always true. That last part, not always true. But that's not the only message of the Seder. That's one of the messages of the Seder, and it lives, I think, comfortably alongside a story of covenant and a story of dreaming and a story of the Jewish people saying that the fact that they want to destroy us does not exonerate us from our work of self-definition of who we want to be in the world. And what I'm watching in the Jewish community is the return to anti-Semitism becomes a vehicle to talk about anti-Semitism exclusively and to not talk about who we as the Jewish people want to be. And what's most tragic about it is that anti-Semitism is not about Jews. It's about anti-Semites. You're the object of their hatred. We don't create it. We can create a whole bunch of other things. Now, I don't think that the Jewish people solving our own problems, whether it's around faith, whether it's around a vision for a moral improvement to the state of Israel, none of those are going to solve anti-Semitism. But if I know I can't beat anti-Semitism, and by the way, we're never going to beat it, it's never going to go away. If I know I can't beat it, do I want to be able to then still say, after having lived a meaningful Jewish life, this is what I built? And that's what I want the Hartman Institute to be known for. Not, we gave more Torah on anti-Semitism. We got some material. I got some stuff. But are we a people who could also be in charge of charting our own destiny, morally and politically and otherwise, and and of course, put a guard outside the shul? Not saying that you don't have to choose between those, but I think that's what we as Jews need to be about, the pursuit of our own destiny.
Thank you, Dr. Kurtzer. It's been a pleasure. Thank you all for joining us for In the Spotlight. Hope to see you next time. This is Abby Pogreben signing off.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.